Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode with Dr. Randy Bunch and myself, Cameron Bunch. We've just been going over the past few weeks a series in apologetics and kind of just giving a summary of a very introductory crash course to apologetics. What is apologetics? Why has it become a necessary thing for believers to be invested into the idea of apologetics? And again, apologetics comes from apologia, to make a defense. So it's just making an intellectual defense for our faith. And it doesn't always have to be. I mean, apologetics can be our own testimony, but more commonly, more recently, it's become a more intellectual argument for different arguments in intelligent design and why God could be the creator of the universe, of this world, and of humans. And so we've been looking over what the past looked like and where did this idea of pushing away from God and secularism and materialism come from, and then addressing the counter ideas to that, how, and in the past weeks it's been how the universe has come about, and last week we looked at more our local system of how it came about. And so we've been kind of going through a lot of information, and we're going to be wrapping up the series for now this week on just kind of looking at ourselves and the intelligent design that goes into creating us humans, because we are made in the image of God. And so it's a great stopping place for now. And there's a lot of areas that we're not going to cover in apologetics. And one of the reasons is that it can get to be a lot of dry information. And so we do want to break up a series like this into different parts and to get into other topics. And for this series, I've kind of been taking the stance of asking my dad, who has a doctorate in this background and has taught at colleges, at a Bible college, on apologetics. And so I've kind of taken the questioner side, and he's been the answer. And we've kind of been going back and forth. So today we're going to end on more the person, the human being. And also, just for you guys aware, because I noticed, and my dad and I were kind of joking about it before, last week, I kept looking over at my notes. So if you see me dazing off into space, it's because I have another monitor off to the side. I've tried to kind of move it closer so it doesn't look like I'm dazing off to the end. But we do have notes that we'll occasionally be looking over at. So starting off with today, Dad, let's just start off with, actually, before we start, because we've been going through apologetics a lot, what are some resources that you would recommend if people are curious that they could pursue looking into themselves?
Yeah, somebody has said we're in the golden age of apologetics now, and I think that's true because there are so many wonderful voices out there that have taken up the banner, as it were, answered the secularists who are basically saying God is a delusion, belief in God is foolish. It's interesting, the Bible claps back and says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So you have to decide who you want to be intimidated by, Richard Dawkins or God. But nevertheless, there's all this peer pressure, for Christians to kind of backpedal on their faith. And, I've said it again and again throughout this series, Cameron. I want to say it again to the people listening, that do not allow anybody who is trying to push around their intellectual weight intimidate you from your faith in God. Far smarter people than them, whoever they are, have believed in God, believed in the Lord Jesus Christ, out of the scientific community. Maybe one of the most heralded scientists in the history of science is Sir Isaac Newton, a very devoted believer, wrote more on theology than he did on science, and yet he's heralded still by secularists today. It's one of the greatest scientific minds ever, and we could go down and give you a smorgasbord list of men who not only were theists, but some who had great faith in Christ, including Alan Sandage, the great grandfather of astronomy, the heir to be, as it were, or the heir apparent of Edwin Lewis Hubble, Edwin Hubble, Edwin Lewis Hubble, I don't know where that came from, Edwin Hubble, who of course has this giant telescope in space named after him. So been a lot of great men of science who are also men of God. Today we know, you and I know, people like Stephen C. Meyer, John Lennox, men who hold, in some cases, multiple doctorates and teach at the highest levels of the academy, that are very vociferous in their faith and very able to defend the Christian faith. William Lane Craig, I don't think anybody has a more adroit mind in making an argument than William Lane Craig. So there's a lot of people out there, and there are resources galore. One place I would point them to kind of access a lot of these is my website. If you go to Randy Lane Bunch, my name, randylanebunch.org, the main menu, you'll notice it says apologetics, and we call it Apologetic Starter Toolkit. And the reason why we do that is if you click that, there'll be a drop-down list. There'll be videos, wonderful videos. I encourage you to watch those. We're going to be talking about the complexity of biological systems today. There's some stuff there by James Tour, Stephen C. Meyer and others that are wonderful on this topic. We have audio files, especially James Tour. We have several on him, and he's the one who's a nanoscientist who deals with origin of life issues and molecular machines and things like that. Just amazing. And so go to our website, randylanebunch.org, go up to the, in the top of the menu, the button that says apologetics, see the drop down list. And then we also have books that are listed by various people from the expressing the biblical worldview, both from science and philosophical as well as theological positions. So Cameron, that would be a great place for people to start. And by the way, I just got contacted by Summit Bible College again today. As you mentioned, I've been teaching apologetics there for quite some time. They called me today. I'm pretty sure since summertime is coming and it's a summertime class that I'll be teaching apologetics again this coming quarter. So if anybody's interested, go to summitbiblecollege.com and you can sign up. They have different degree programs. I'll give them a quick plug. And so go to summitbiblecollege.com and I'll be teaching apologetics. So you could still sign up, get a degree in theology or any of these disciplines and take our apologetics course. So that's kind of just, maybe that will give you access then. And from our site, you can go on then. And we have a list, by the way, of many websites that people can go to. Discovery Institute, John Lennox, pretty much the who's who of apologetics today is on that list. So access our website. That'll be a great place for them to begin.
Absolutely. And I think as you've pointed out, I mean, these guys are all connected very much to one another. So as you branch out from your website and start reading some of those materials, start listening, they're going to mention other people that will reference you to other people. And soon enough, you'll just kind of know the whole community of apologetics and the top thinkers really that are around today, just coming out with new research. And like you said, Discovery Institute always coming out with new findings, new science, and just looking at different studies being revealed every day just for further evidence for intelligent design and for the existence of God.
The interesting thing too, the granddaddy for me of apologetics was Josh McDowell. You don't hear as much about him today. He's an older man now. He's got to be, God, I think he's right. He's got to be pushing 80. Sorry, Josh, if I'm wrong. But his son, Sean McDowell, who has got a doctorate and teaches apologetics at Biola University, is a very prominent voice of apologetics today. And I remember he had a book years ago that they just revamped and rewrote together called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's still one of the best books out there, but it's, again, the problem with academics and accessing apologetics is that it's very academic, and accessing the info sometimes feels like your brain goes into a cramp sometimes, just the language, the terminologies. If you're not initiated into that world, it can be like listening to an electrician talk about, I don't know, diodes and ohms and watts and volts. And, if you don't know it, you don't know what they're talking about. So some of these guys, they've spent a lot of time in the academy knowing the lingo. And so sometimes a popularizer like an Eric Metaxas, or even like what we're doing through this series, is good because he'll kind of put it down on the layman's level. That's how I have to get it. I have to listen to guys that are academic, try to filter through that, and then listen to other guys that are maybe a little bit more popularizers. Now I've familiarized myself a little bit with the language, but today I was listening to a lecture on biological systems, and most of what he's saying is going over my head, but I get enough to understand the argument. And that's really what the point is. You don't have to know all the mathematics behind the laws of physics to be able to make a good apologetics argument. So thank God all these guys are out there and making their defense. And that's our job, is to be able to make a defense. If you have a good argument, you don't have to be argumentative. If you've got a good defense, you don't have to get defensive. And that's the idea, being confident in what we believe, knowing the ground on which we stand so that we can make a competent and coherent argument for the sake of the gospel.
And I think that's something that we referenced even back in the very first episode that we started in apologetics, is that it's very easy to get defensive because we don't feel like we have a good enough defense. And when we get defensive, we can get mean, and then we can get divisive. And I mean, there are times where like I have to be careful. Like if I'm like getting attacked with like an attack, I have to remember I'm like, I have an argument and I don't need to like get angry or bitter. And it's like, right, they're not attacking me, they're attacking God. So I'm just here to be a representative to God. And so it's, I mean, Jesus said, they do not deny you, they denied me. Right. And so, I mean, we have the responsibility to make a defense. And when we are confident, we don't feel like we need to get defensive because they start listing another argument and we're like, well, I've heard this before. And I was just thinking about it the other day of realistically, you don't hear many unique arguments from someone who is not a believer. It is the same few arguments of why does evil exist? What about the Big Bang? What about evolution? And realistically, you're either coming from a place of hurt, like I said, why do bad things happen to good people? Or you've been taught in school about the Big Bang and evolution.
Right.
And it's not really too many unique ideas. So if you can have a solid argument for just a few questions, you're very comfortable in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Once you get the main arguments down, it's just kind of like updating yourself on the new data coming out. And that's a good point. And the interesting thing is, we haven't even talked about the fact that there are arguments that can be made philosophically that have nothing to do with science. We're dealing with one particular set of arguments, particularly along the line of science, because you and I really enjoy that. But there are philosophical arguments. For example, you can kind of prove just philosophically that the world has to be finite. Because, for example, if you had an endless number of yesterdays, you could not possibly ever get to today. So the whole idea of infinity is not tenable realistically. You can talk about it in kind of metaphorical terms if you want, but when it comes down to brass tacks, that's another reason why in mathematics you can't literally use infinity. You have to, because it creates too many conundrums, too many what's the word I'm looking for? Too many inconsistencies. Like I'm not thinking of the right word, but transfinite math, all this stuff, it's all theoretical, but it's not practical. It doesn't work as far as like the kind of math you would use to balance your checkbook or something like that. So it's fun to talk about theoretical physics, and people talk about, the multiverse and all this kind of stuff, but these are just pure speculations. These are just, again, constructs that are speculative, trying to surmise how could something have happened, particularly without a creator. That's where a lot of this stuff comes from. But nevertheless, again, some of the arguments can be made without even knowing science. So that's another side to it that we haven't really touched on. For another time, we'll get to, and like you said, we haven't touched on archaeology, paleontology, philosophy. We haven't talked about the moral argument, which was maybe one of the most profound arguments for the existence of God. But we'll get to those another time. We'll do a part 2. But again, they're just as complex in some ways as the material we've gone over. So it's better to do it another time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did look up, Josh McDowell is in his 80s, so you are safe. Yeah, I don't think he'll be upset. So you are accurate on that. He's 82. So let's move into kind of design and biological systems. So when entering into a discussion with someone, where would you start with the conversation into design for a biological system, or for even ourselves?
Right. Well, let's remind ourselves, we're talking about what's known as the teleological argument. The idea behind the Greek word telos means that there was a goal or purpose. So when it comes to the cosmos, we say it appears that this cosmos, this universe, was designed toward a goal, that goal being intelligent life. So the way we defined it is, it seems that there are multiple features, many features of our universe that are designed within an incredibly narrow set of parameters to allow for intelligent life. When it comes to the argument for teleological evidence of design in living systems, we see the same thing. We see extreme complexity, not just complexity, but what we know as specified complexity, design complexity. Let me give you an example. Let's take Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore, you have 2 examples of complexity. At the bottom of Mount Rushmore, there is a pile of rocks. That is the debris that came from the work of chiseling out the president's faces on that mountain. That pile of rocks, if you look at it, is a complex system of rocks laying upon rocks. It's disordered, it's complex, but there's no order to the complexity. You look at it, you say, pile of rocks. What does it mean? Not a lot. Rocks fell there. But when you look at the presidents, that's also a complex. That's also an evidence of complexity, but it's a complexity we can recognize. It's something we can relate to something else. It has design, it has order, it has familiarity. And what we're saying is that there is complexity in living systems that is better explained by design than by the idea of randomness, which is a whole Darwinian idea that, living systems evolved over the process of millions and billions of years through natural selection, acting on random variations, mutations, and so forth and so on, which is an extremely long process. And our argument is that with the time given, the time constraints given, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years. And of course, life wasn't forming during all that time. Even according to a Darwinian model, there's no way, because you've got time where the Earth is cooling. You've got what they call the primordial soup. And then you've got, at some point, according to their argument, so at some point, some single cell living organism that then later mutates over millions and millions of years. And the computational probabilities and possibilities of having the complex systems of life we have today in that short a period of time are just not tenable. In fact, recently I mentioned this before, and you can find the video actually on my website. One of the videos that I have, that a computer scientist from Harvard who deals with probabilities and mathematics basically said that Stephen Meyer's book, either Signature of the Cell or one of those, convinced him of the impossible computational opportunities. In other words, Darwin just doesn't have enough time with the likelihood or the unlikelihood of living systems occurring with the complexity we see today, developing into us from the amoeba, for example. There's just not enough time. So we say that they're much better answered by design because there seems to be a purpose in them. There's engineering features in them. Well, you don't have engineering without, anytime you develop a car, you do it top down. You start with a mind, a blueprint, and then you begin to apply the materials accordingly. Darwinian says it's bottom up. It started with just, basic materials. And then over time through self-assembly, through this random, mindless, unguided process, here we are. We joke and say from the goo through the zoo to you. But that's kind of a synopsis, right? Yeah. And so we're saying that, the complexity, and, I think we've talked about this before, Cameron, that just intuitively speaking, you look at a butterfly with a beautiful arrangement on its body, on its wings, or you look at, even a field of flowers, or the way a bird flies, or any of these living systems, ecosystems that we have on, you don't look at that and say, wow, it's a good thing that, and here's an interesting thing, by the way, and this comes later in my notes, so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I think this is something that particularly me and those of my generation, I don't know if you would have heard this as much, but I remember sitting in class, maybe, I don't know, the teachers got bored and said, okay, I'm tired of these kids, I'm going to throw on a film. But you would periodically watch a science film in school, those big old reel-to-reel little projector things we would have. And they would show something about nature, and they would show maybe hummingbirds getting together and mating, or the salmon going upstream, or, to mate or whatever. And they would say this again and again, Mother Nature knows. Well, wait a minute, what did you say? Mother Nature knows? An unguided natural process without any intellect knows? So they're trying to attribute intelligence to an unintelligent, naturally unguided process. You can't have it both ways. Nature doesn't know anything. Have you ever had a good conversation with a rock or a blade of grass? No, but they're implying that because we intuitively know that this thing was designed top down, not bottom up. And of course, Darwinists would argue with me about that. But I think just a normal intuitive look at things, it sure looks designed. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck. But then also I would point to some of the quotations made by even some of our best premier secular minds. I'm going to read a quote here from Nobel Prize winning laureate Sir Francis Crick. Sir Francis Crick was famous because he was the one who elucidated the helical structure of the DNA. We've all seen that, wound looking DNA with the little bars going across where all the bases are on there that serve as a digital code. And he and Watson won the Nobel Prize for elucidating that helical structure of the DNA. And this is what he said about origin of life and that kind of thing. He said, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. So Crick was a proponent that life did not begin randomly. Now we're talking about two different things, and let me be clear about this. When we're talking about evolution, we're talking about how living systems that already existed change and adapt and evolve. Now, you and I have talked about the fact, I'm getting a little bit heady here, so if you need to interject to make this clearer for me, but there's different kinds of evolution. There's adaptation over time, which nobody has a problem with. Sheep that live in a very austere, cold environment will eventually develop thicker fur. We can look at the way dogs are bred, right? And they can be bred in certain directions to be larger, smaller. That is part of it. You could call that evolution if you want. It's adaptation, but that is not macro evolution. That's just small variations over time depending on the environment.
Which is referred to as microevolution.
Microevolution. Macroevolution says that we're all from a common descent. So the first living cell became a tree, became a puppy, became you and me, became, you know, an ape, an orangutan. That's what we disagree with. Yeah. And the Cambrian explosion, which we haven't had time to talk about, but that's the evidence of the fossil record, does not support Darwinism at all. All these major animal types show up fully developed with no precursors. And that was a death knell, really. Darwin even said, if we don't find the links in the fossil record, the missing links, if you will, the precursor fossils, then my theory cannot be true, because he believed in slow successive developmental stages.
So to explain that a little bit more, since I think you and I both understand, to explain that a little further, in the Cambrian explosion, out of that came a lot of different species and like different new data that gave rise to a lot of the animal information that we see today, and a lot of the almost kind of like blueprints for life today that we see. But prior to that, there was nothing. And which is what goes against Darwinian evolution.
Like really simple life, like sponges and things like that, but no animal life. And then suddenly, I think it's like 500 something million years ago, in what was known as the Cambrian period, in that strata, they found all these fossils of animals fully developed, no precursors, just fully developed animals, kind of like, and God said, let there be, you know.
Yeah, which is where that's what that missing is from Darwin's explanation, is what you were saying, is that in that Cambrian explosion, all those 500 million species or whatever came in. And that's why
and all these animal types, not all of them, not some of the mammals, but like certain of the animals, because even in the Bible, the fish come first and then the mammals. And so you see that progression in nature. And I was listening to a scientist say that every time a major body plan is reintroduced in the fossil record, it begins just fresh, no precursors, no intermediate stages, all the things that Darwin said must be there. So now that's evolution. But when we're talking about origin of life, that's different. And we're going to be talking about both of these things. So origin of life has to do with how did life begin? Evolution deals with how it adapted after it came. But origin of life is another matter entirely. And that's what Crick is addressing here, is that living systems are so complex, and getting life, just even to have the right enzymes and the right materials coming together by chance, is just absolutely improbable. In fact, Sir Fred Hoyle, who again derogatorily named the Big Bang what he named it, said this. He said, the trouble is that there are about 2,000 enzymes, and the chance of obtaining them all in a random trial is only 1 part in 10 to the 20th times 2,000. That is 10 to the 40,000. 1 in 10 to the 40,000. An outrageously small probability that could not be faced even if the whole universe consisted of organic soup. So what he's saying is that there's really no chance that life could have emerged by random chance. It just, and this goes back to what they call chemical evolution. And there was an experiment done in the 50s called the
Miller-Urey experiment.
Yeah, thank you. And what they did was they tried to create what they assumed might be the prebiotic environment. And then they zapped it with electricity, and they ended up getting a few amino acids. And so this was hailed as proof that, you know, life can come from non-life. Now that has been completely disregarded, discredited. Nobody believes that today either. Even those guys would say that was a failed experiment, because number one, it did not represent what we think was the early environment on the earth. And amino acids, which they got a couple of the primary amino, that's so far from life. But this misses the argument, because now we know that you can have all the elements needed for life. In fact, you can take a cell, you can take a living cell, put it in a, test tube, puncture that, and let that, all those materials in that cell pour out into the water. So you've got everything there. A while ago it was a living cell. Now it's just the raw materials of a living cell, right? We still don't know how to get that to life. In other words, if scientists could have all of it there together all at once, we still don't know how that it goes from inorganic matter to life. Nobody knows. And this is an area where James Tour, and like I said, on my website, I have a number of audios as well as videos about him talking about this. He wants there to be a moratorium, an absolute end to financing origin of life research, because he said since Miller-Urey, we're no further. We don't know anything more than we ever did before. And the funny thing is, every once in a while, there'll be an experiment where some scientist goes to a lab, puts all this stuff together, does something and says, oh, I got a reaction. See this, I got something that worked here. And he said, the funny thing is, and this is where Stephen C. Meyer comes in, he said, what they're not realizing is that scientist had to inject his intelligence to create the environment just so that they could get whatever very basic reaction they got, which is still light years from anything remotely, associated with life. So the fact of the matter is, they might talk big, but we, from a materialist standpoint, we have zero idea of how life got here. Now, as believers, we don't have any problem knowing that at all. In the beginning, God created. God said. He brought forth life as a special creation. And so we don't have any issue with the fact that, yeah, life adapts. Things get a harder beak, a thinner beak, or whatever, because of the environment. But actually what they're discovering now is that is built into the design system. It's not environment controlling that. That's programming that's inside the living system, not external forces, but internal forces. And so, come a long way from the days in which, but you got to think about it. When Darwin wrote his book, Origin of the Species, it was 1859. That's back in the steamboat days. That's Tom Sawyer days. So to even assume that we could build a reasonable model of life and even how we got here in our present forms from something discovered in 1850, that's ridiculous. I don't know of any other scientific procedure that is relying on something found in the early 1800s to show a viable, model today. And so I think that's part of the problem. Back then, they assumed that the cell was this just kind of globular mass, but now we know that cells are hyper complex, literally like a city. They've got production systems, they've got self-replicating and self-repairing systems, they've got waste management systems. A cell is like a functioning city, just an incredibly small one. And so we know now that the specified complexity of living things of life is incredibly, incredibly complex.
So that kind of brings us into what in our body, what part of our cells, what part actually gives credence to show more of the actual complexity. Because you mentioned that our cells are complex, and that DNA, you kind of hinted, bringing in Francis Crick, that DNA was obviously very complex. So what does that look like? Because one of the things you pointed out earlier was talking about with Mount Rushmore is that not only is there complexity, but the ability to read the complexity. So what are some things looking into our body as complex systems that point towards that?
Well, evidence of design, we can start with DNA. DNA is a great example. It's often called the language of life. Inside of every one of us, we have about 100 trillion cells in our body, and inside of every one of them is this double helix shaped DNA molecule. DNA is basically a library. It's a communication system of 3.1 billion bits of information that tell amino acids how to align themselves in chains to successfully create three-dimensional proteins, which is what makes us up. Now, not all the information in our cells is in DNA, but a good part of it is. And DNA, like I said, it's like a library. I think it was Lee Strobel said that a teaspoon of DNA could hold the information for every living system, every living creature that has ever existed, and every library book that has ever been published. Give you an idea. And yet James Tour says carbohydrates even far more complex and a better information system. So it's amazing. I mean, we're talking about, we were in the macro world, right, with the universe. Now we're talking about the micro world, the very, very small. I want to read. In fact, why don't you read, if you got it there, that thing, Unlocking the Mystery of Life?
Yeah. So this is an excerpt from Lee Strobel's The Case for a Creator. If you guys have not
actually
read it.
I got this from Lee Strobel, but this is actually a documentary done by the Discovery Institute that he's quoting, I believe. But go ahead and read that.
Okay, that's good to know. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a selection of the DNA helix to expose genetic instructions needed to assemble specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called ribosome. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from the other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecule machine to the exact location where it is needed.
Now, I would just ask anybody hearing that paragraph you just read, does that sound like something that developed by chance over billions of years through unguided natural processes? Or does that sound like something the Ford engineering plant put together? It sounds exactly like an engineered system. And I was telling you that just before today, I mean, it had to be God just led me to watch a lecture by the Discovery Institute. The scientist, I can't think of his name right now, he said, what I'm sharing with you today is brand new information. And this was a 2022 lecture. He said, this is brand new, hot off the presses. He said, but what they began to do is they've had a hard time understanding certain specified complexity of living systems going at it from a Darwinian model. In other words, if this is just chance, they're having a hard time understanding this. So what they did was they began teaming up with engineers. Engineers look at things different than a molecular biologist. They look at things from a design perspective, because that's what engineers do. They do top-down design. So what they began to realize working with the engineers is that if they presumed not a Darwinian model, but a design model with top-down engineering, they could understand far more about how life developed. So even though they're not calling it divine design, they're still, even they would still say, oh, it's just random, but they're having to use a design model to move forward in their research, which is very telling. So they're kind of like saying, yeah, it looks like, sounds like, walks like, talks like, oh, but it's not, kind of thing. But now a lot of articles are coming out, and I'd encourage anybody to go to, Discovery Institute or even YouTube and look up the Discovery Institute. You can find this lecture very easily, I'm sure. And they basically said that, more and more articles are coming out now saying that the Darwinian model just simply does not respond or have an answer to the obvious design features of these living systems. And so the sad thing is that a number of the books that were written to try to refute design and say, well, it looks designed, but isn't, were really dishonest, I think. And that's what I was kind of getting out of the lecture is this guy was saying, they say that, but it's not true. But general John Q. public doesn't know that. And the reason why they're saying that is because they have a priori commitment to materialism. They already have a commitment to philosophical naturalism. They're already committed to that worldview, in other words. So they're only giving answers through that lens rather than being opened to the idea of intelligent design. But fortunately, real thinkers aren't closed to the idea of God being behind this. And I read this last time, or at least part of it, I think. But as I've said before, more recently, the four horsemen of the new atheism were Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam. Yeah, Sam. I can't think. I don't know why. Every time I try to mention his name, I forget his name. But anyway, those four guys. I just watched an article, a debate with Sam and William Lane Craig the other day. I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, before those guys came on the scene and Richard Dawkins kind of became known as a premier atheist, probably the most respected atheistic thinker was a guy by the name of Anthony Flew, later Sir Anthony Flew. He was an atheist all his life. Until the end of his life, he became a theist. I don't know that he ever came to faith in Jesus, but he did come to the point where he said, if there is a God, it has to be the God of the Bible, because he meets the criteria for the God that would have designed all this. But this is what he said. I now believe there is a God. So he believed in some kind of God. I now think the evidence, does point to a creative intelligence almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. What I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown by the most unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinary diverse elements to work together. He also went on to say, we have all the evidence we need in our immediate experience, and that only a deliberate refusal to look is responsible for atheism in any variety. Now, that's a pretty amazing statement coming from a guy that was a committed lifelong materialist. But here's the thing. Why is DNA so telling? What DNA essentially is a digital code. Along the back of the double helix, there are these four chemical bases. They're assigned a word value. I forget it, A, C, T, G, or whatever it is. But they operate as a digital code. In fact, Bill Gates said DNA is exactly like a digital code we use in our computers, although it's far more complex than anything we've ever developed. Because basically, digital code is just binary, ones and zeros. This is a 4-letter chemical alphabet, which basically tells, as you read in that description, tells the cell how to form proteins by assembling long chain amino acids in a certain way. If you don't get the order right, then that protein does not fold and become a 3-dimensional protein. So it's information. That's the issue. It's a digital code. It's information. Well, we know that with any computer, the only way you get digital code is to have a programmer. And let me ask you this, Cameron. If I were to give you a flash drive and say, just stick this in your computer, it's just random code, but who knows? Maybe you'll get some. Would you do it? Probably not. You know, this will destroy my system. Randomness always leads toward entropy, right? It leads to disorder. So in order to have the specified complexity of information, the only source we know that comes from is a mind.
Yeah.
So, and not only that, but here's another thought. DNA is a code, but how does the cell know how to read the code? Who told it to? What's going on there? It had to be something pre-designed by an intelligent mind. I mean, that to me is the logical outworking of this. That's what Flew saw. Like I said, those that are not committed to materialism, I think it's a very short jump to realizing, okay, if we have information in digital code telling the body how to work like a computer program or like an assembly line or like a factory, because that's really what you read in that, that's a factory.
That's one of the things that if you actually look at it in regard to how Bill Gates described it as a computer code, not only is the body writing this code, but it has to unencrypt this code. It has to unwind it, read it, transcribe it, send it. And at the other end, it has to be able to unencrypt and read it.
Yeah.
And then, so it is an incredibly complex system to not only write, but to unencrypt, to send, and to make sure that it can be sent in a different format. That'd be like you asking me to like create a file, change it, like create a Word document, create it into a PDF, send it to you, and then you would open the PDF and then you would type it into Word yourself. Like that is the complexity. That's not just a, oh, I'm gonna happen to hit my keys in the right kind of way, make the Word document, convert the Word document, send it to you in a PDF, you to undo it. Like it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and we're not going to be able to get into all this today. There's a lot of stuff we have that we're not going to get into today, but I do want to share this because we're kind of we're closing down to the end of our time. Today in that lecture, one of the things that I heard this guy say, and I was so thankful to hear him say that, is a lot of biological scientists have said, well, if this was designed, it's poorly designed. And they picked on certain aspects, like they've said, well, the knee of the human being was not a good design. The ankles are a bunch of extra bones that they didn't need. The eye, it could have been designed better. After all, the retina turns everything upside down. The receptors for vision, the light receptors are turned backward the wrong way. Well, when they brought these engineers in, these engineers were like, no, these are optimally designed. Now, let me give you a good example of optimal design. I've got a laptop. You and I are both talking into a laptop, right? Well, my laptop has a great screen, has a great processor, but this laptop, this Mac it doesn't have necessarily the best speakers, but it has the optimal speakers it can when you put it together with all the other functions of the computer. So if you have one area that's, optimal, you might have to compromise a little bit on the size of something else or the shape of something, so in other words, when you design a human body, some things you might have to turn upside down, and then you have error correcting systems that make it work, that kind of thing. But what the scientists have realized as they've got these engineers involved is that all these designs are not compromised at all. Another great example is DNA. For years, I said 90% of DNA is junk. Well, now we know it's not. It regulates. It's almost like, put it this way, the DNA that you can read is like the letters. The rest of it's like periods and punctuation. It tells it when to go, when not to go, that kind of thing. So it's part of the code. There is no, as far as we know, there is probably no junk DNA. So they're unraveling more and more about the fact is it's just far more complex. And the thing that I love that he said is this. He said, it's true that biological engineering is a little bit different than our engineering, but wherever they found a disparity or a difference, the biological engineering is always superior to what we would have done. And that shows you that God, of course, being more intelligent, it wasn't that God wasn't doing it well. He just did it so well, we couldn't recognize how well he did it. But now that we brought these guys in that understand top-down engineering and are looking at it from that standpoint, they're saying, no, these things are wonderfully optimized. Same thing with the ankle bones. And let me go ahead and, let's go. We don't have time to do all this stuff, molecular and all this stuff. But I think we should go back, close with the thing about the eye.
Yeah. Before we do mention that, I was going to say, I was watching Stephen C. Meyer, and he was talking about how, because you were talking about how a lot of people thought that there was 90% useless junk in DNA. And I was going to try and see if I could find the quote that I heard him speak on, but I can't. But it was something that for every one correct way to form a DNA molecule, there's something like 1 × 10 to the 167th incorrect ways to form that molecule. So all that space, because just like a program, let's say you have Facebook as a program and you just start throwing in random programming, like in lines of code, you're going to eventually there's going to be deviations, mutations, and eventually that system's going to crash. And you can't bring that system back by continually putting in random code and source lines and everything. It has to be intelligently fixed and created. So I just thought that was a good point that he had made, and a good piece of evidence.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about design, the eye, the human eye is maybe the apex example of this. And so I'm on my notes, Cameron, I'm on page 11 near the bottom here. And there's a quote from Dr. David N. Menton, PhD. He wrote an article simply entitled The Eye. So I'm going to read this real quickly here. It says, it has been estimated that 10 billion calculations occur every second in the retina before the light image even gets to the brain. It is sobering to compare this to the performance of the most powerful man-made computer. In an article published in the computer magazine Byte in April 1985, Dr. John Stevens said, to simulate 10 milliseconds of the complete processing of even a single nerve cell from the retina would require the solution of about 500 simultaneous nonlinear differential equations 100 times and would take at least several minutes of processing time on a Cray supercomputer. Keeping in mind that there are 10 million or more such cells interacting with each other in complex ways, it would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second. What a great place to wind up our discussion. I mean, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and the complexity, the specified complexity is without par. I mean, all we can do is really sit back and marvel and say, what a great and imaginative God we have. And the diversity, it's not just that he made us. You look at nature, everything from, I'm sitting here in my backyard, right? I see the sunshine, speaks to cosmology. I see the ecosystems, the animals. Everything I'm looking at is an incredibly complex, finely tuned system that all works together.
Yeah.
And you want to tell me that happened in 13.8 billion, and even when it comes to life, in a far more narrow margin than that by chance? I just leave it to the intelligence of our listener to decide for themselves.
And the fact that we are just one type of, technically, a species. We are human. There is birds, there are dogs, there are just countless animal species and plant species, all of them which have their unique functions, and somehow their cells are working to tell them how to do something and to function. And we only looked at the eye and the DNA today. I mean, if you think about how many systems are going through our bodies and through other animals' bodies and the complexity of each one of them, and even just the instinct that animals have that is somehow written into their nature and their code and their source. I mean, we could go on for days on, but I think our goal here today was, and over the past couple of weeks, like we said, we wanted to introduce you to some ideas of apologetics, some introduction to how it came about, for how secularism and materialism came about. What are some introductory ideas to how the universe was formed, or to how our local system, which we would see in cosmology, and just even a small introduction to teleological argument of how our bodies and what was the design and the intent behind it. So there are a lot of things. And like we said, if you go to my dad's website, randylanebunch.org, and just look at some of those resources, I promise you have a lot of resources there that you can just get lost in for days and for years of just learning, because we see so much information that we learn through school, and that takes years to learn. But a lot of that is from old data or from old information or from one side of a picture and looking at it through a broken lens, realistically, because it's looking at it through a Darwinian lens and hoping to prove it correct. When a lot of the things that I learned, even in high school, because when I went to high school, the Miller-Urey experiment was still being taught, and just so many different experiments that were actually debunked shortly after they came out, or they had other colleagues that said, well, this doesn't work because of A, B, or C. And it wasn't, some of them weren't trying to cheat, but some of them were.
Yeah.
And so it's worked off faulty information. So there's so much information that's out there and available in apologetics. So if you're interested, you can definitely look into that further.
And the interesting thing is, in the intelligent design community, it's not just believers in Jesus. There are, Jewish people, non-theists, but just people honest enough to look at the information and say, okay, we give. It didn't happen by chance. I mean, you'd have to be dishonest, I think, with the information you'd have to be falsely loyal to like I said, a pre-existing philosophy to not, interpret the information objectively. That's how it seems to me. And you and I have kind of laughed at some of the scientists we've heard. I think most recently of one, we were talking about how he was talking about how all these elements that represent life are so common to the universe. It's got to be out there all over the place. And you and I both said that's dishonest. He knows better than that. But at the same time, they're clinging. Like, it reminds me, I guess, I've always said, it reminds me of the movie Weekend at Bernie's. If you've never seen the movie, it is actually hilarious. I watched it by accident. Somehow it was on somewhere and I was going to turn it off, and it was so hilarious. I ended up watching the whole thing. I can't vouch for the language. I don't remember, but it's two guys who go to someone's house. The guy ends up dying, and they have to go through the movie trying to convince people he's alive. So they put sunglasses on him and they dress him, and eventually, throughout the movie, he's decomposing. Parts are falling off, and they're having, and to me, that's what scientists are doing with Darwin. They're trying to keep glasses on and make him look like he's still alive, like his theory's still relevant, and it's just falling apart. The evidence is just caving Darwin in. And the good news is it's pointing to the truth. And the truth is there is a God who loves us, who created us intentionally, who not only loved us, but went to the trouble to redeem us, to send his only begotten son to be our sin and burden bearer, that we might have relationship with him. And it's an amazing thing that we can see witness of God in science, but more importantly, we see witness of God in the love of the cross, what Jesus did in dying on our behalf, God becoming flesh, what we call the hypostatic union, or the hippohypostatic, I always get that wrong, of God becoming man to be our burden bearer, to identify with us in our misery and our pain and our suffering, in our sin, paying the price, bearing the burden we couldn't, so that we could identify with him now in this new creation life. How wonderful it is. So that's where our discussion ultimately ends, is in the reality of God and his great love for us.
Yeah, and in the upcoming weeks, we're gonna, like we said, we're stepping away from apologetics, and we'll probably be getting into more personal aspects of our faith and just spiritual aspects, because we don't want to. I think I want to say it's Paul that says that, like in one of his letters, that knowledge puffs up, and at some point, I mean, we can get very prideful on our knowledge, and I mean, there is a good side of knowledge, but there's also relying on the Holy Spirit and relying on God and leaning into him, because all of this is impossible without him. And that's kind of what the point of apologetics is not to put in pride, but more to put in humility, to show us that it's not just random, that it's not us, it's nothing that we've accomplished, but what the beauty that he's accomplished.
That's right.
So we'll be getting into some of those, but for now we are going to end. And as always, Dad, would you like to end in prayer?
Yeah. Father, thank you so much for these discussions. If there's a hungry heart out there that's saying, what do I need to do to be saved? The Bible said, he who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Just call on his name. Jesus, save me. I'm a sinner. I can't save myself, but I believe you died for me. Come into my heart. Be my Lord and Savior. Take over management of my life. It's not the words, it's the heart expression of faith toward him and what he's done for you that matters. So, Father, we pray that you'd continue to soften hearts, move upon us, help us to continue to grow in knowledge and humility. As Cameron said, knowledge puffs up. Help us to ever recognize our dependency upon you. May our minds be expanded to appreciate the wonder of creation, what you've done, what you've provided for us, but most importantly, what you accomplished for us through the cross, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We give you thanks and praise for it, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All
All right.
righty. We'll see you
Okay.
next time.
Yep. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.